At least start with the safety message because I think we've got quite a few people already here and we can run through that real quick. So thanks for joining Phase 4 Workshop 2. This will be the first workshop this week. We're actually going to be holding 3, and I'll talk about that in just a moment when we get to our agenda. But we'll be discussing the topics of overall residual risk, risk tolerance, and simple optimization throughout those 3 days. And we're going to stick pretty strictly, I think, to the agenda, but I'll come back to that in just a minute. For now, our safety message is about carbon monoxide safety. So according to the Consumer Product Safety Commission, more than 150 people in the United States die every year from accidental non-fire related carbon monoxide poisoning. So stay safe and be aware of the dangers of carbon monoxide that can harm yourself and your loved ones at home. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas that can be deadly if inhaled. It is produced by burning fuel in vehicles, generators, stoves, and heaters. And there's a few safety tips that we wanted to share related to this issue. So you can install and maintain carbon monoxide detectors, and you can place those detectors on every level of your home, especially in your sleeping areas. Make sure to change the batteries at least once a year or whenever the alarm chirps to signal a low battery power. Mine chirps far too often, and I've had to replace batteries way too often. Same for my fire alarms. And they chirp at 2 a.m. So ensure proper ventilation. You should ensure that all gas appliances are properly installed and ventilated. Never use gas-powered generators or grills indoors. Hopefully you don't do that. Avoid idling cars. Never leave your car running in your garage, even if the door is open. This can quickly lead to dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. And understand symptoms. Be aware of symptoms like dizziness, shortness of breath, headache, and nausea. If you suspect that you've gotten carbon monoxide poisoning, get fresh air immediately and call 911. And then make sure to stay proactive with these simple steps. You can help keep your home safe and the dangers and stay away from the dangers of carbon monoxide poisoning. I'm going to post a little note in the chat and also help us note that the chat is working. Great. So I'll start in on our presentation just to let everybody know that this meeting is being recorded. One or more decision makers may be present during the meeting, but no decisions will be taken. And let's take a quick roll call from various parties. Is Southern California Edison on the line?
Yes, Southern California Edison is on the line.
Great. And the Utility Reform Network? Let's see, I think Tom was here just a second ago. Are you still with us, Tom?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
Okay, great. And then Muscle Grade Road Alliance.
Joseph Mitchell's here.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. And the Sempra companies. Anyone from Sempra?
Good morning, Eddie. We're on the line.
Great. Pacific Gas and Electric.
Present.
Thank you. Anyone from Energy Producers and Users Coalition Indicated Shippers?
Yes, Eddie, this is Jim Mosier, and Mike Gorman and Colin Fitzhenry from Brubaker and Associates are also on the line.
Okay, great, thanks. Public Advocate's Office. Oh, I said, oh, there you are. Go ahead.
Yes, Cal Advocates is here. Thank you.
Thank you. Protect Our Communities Foundation. Okay. Utilities Consumers Action Network. And are there any others that would like to be recognized? And if so, please feel free to write your name and your organization in the chat, and so that you can be properly recognized. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a pretty fixed agenda to make sure that we can accommodate both the presenters, but also stakeholder schedules. I don't anticipate, kind of deviating from this agenda because of the fact that we have a lot of discussion that's still going to happen tomorrow and on Friday. So, if we wrap up early today, I think that's fine. But there's a lot of opportunity for discussion. Thank you, Matthew. And, we're going to really be walking through this fairly at a pretty, I would say, steady pace, but we're intending to, kind of gradually work through the topics that were in the staff proposal. And we'll start today by looking at overall residual risk, and then we'll talk about risk tolerance, and we'll kind of set a foundation for risk tolerance by talking about probability distributions. And that's going to be our main discussion points today and our main presentations. But then after the break, we'll have another discussion about tail average risk, and then we'll spend the last half hour in a general discussion. And then tomorrow and Friday, we'll be continuing with the discussion of risk tolerance, but we'll also briefly talk about simple optimization. And I think on Friday, we'll still have a little bit of simple optimization to discuss, but the goal is to open up for a pretty general discussion. So that's, the basic agenda that I wanted to share, but I'll probably come back to that in just a second. I wanted to first go over some attendee participation. The first is if you have any IT-related questions, they can be directed to George Diocampo. And George, if you could put your email in the chat, I'd really appreciate that. Just note that attendees have the ability to mute and unmute themselves, but we do ask that you stay muted except during the Q&A period. During the presentation portion of each session, attendees can enter questions in the chat box, and please address the questions to everyone, not just to a single individual, so that everyone can see them. And then we will do, maybe folks on SPD can also help me to, occasionally interrupt if there's any clarifying questions. But non-clarifying questions should really be held until the discussion period. And like I said, we have lots of discussion periods for the workshops these 3 days. And if there's not enough time to respond to all the chat box questions during the workshop, SPD will collect answers to those questions, and then we'll circulate them to the service list. So during the discussion period, please use the hand raise function to speak, and I will do my best, or someone on an SPD as well could help to call on attendees in order. And after the question is asked, attendees, just please remember to lower your hands. Great. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and ask Commissioner Reynolds to please feel free to give us some opening remarks, and then we'll come back and discuss some timeline and expected outcomes for this workshop.
Thank you, Eddie, and wonderful to see everyone this morning. So thanks everyone for your participation today. I appreciate the work that the Safety Policy Division has done to organize today's workshop, and thanks to all of the parties for their engagement in this proceeding and in this workshop. Thanks also to IT for supporting making today's virtual workshop possible. We will cover a number of in-the-weeds topics today that will help us further develop and refine the risk-based decision-making framework, including overall residual risk, risk tolerance, and the idea of optimal portfolios for risk mitigations. From a high-level perspective, my hope is to further develop and refine the analytical tools that we have to get better insight into how utilities are progressing on reducing risk over time. What processes can we establish for determining what is a tolerable amount of risk from the perspective of the public? How do we assess what is a reasonable amount of risk reduction in the context of a GRC? How do we determine which GRC proposals or suite of proposals accomplish the reasonable amount of risk reduction? How do we encourage record development in a GRC that results in different options for suites of risk mitigation proposals? Risk mitigations do not exist in isolation and may impact one another, such as undergrounding, covered conductor, and vegetation management. In GRCs, we need to have real visibility into trade-offs and uncertainties in order to make decisions and optimize funding to deliver on risk reduction. And I would observe that there is continuing need for improvement in that visibility. I do not want future GRCs to have competing parties in their corners arguing that their proposed collection of mitigations is the only appropriate approach to risk reduction. We need to move to a future where stakeholders and safety staff are in a constructive dialogue about risk, uncertainty, and mitigation. Today's discussion of overall residual risk is an important dive into how we can view IOU's progress over time. And I want to recognize for a moment the challenges of doing risk analysis on a dynamic and changing system, and why there's still significant value in doing so. Changing real-life conditions and new technologies can make mapping risk reduction and overall residual risk over a longer period of time difficult, but that should not prevent us from making our risk assessments transparent and easier for the people of California to understand. And we as decision makers need to make decisions based on the best information we have available at the time, much like we expect utilities to make decisions based on the best data that they have available at any given time. We all appreciate and acknowledge that risk is not static. Safety issues are dynamic and changing, and utilities should have flexibility to make decisions about their systems that are responsive to current conditions. Despite that reality, it is our responsibility to analyze the risk as we see it today and find ways to analyze how that risk is being reduced over time. To quote an old statistics aphorism, all models are wrong and some are useful. Our goal is to find tools that are useful and actionable in GRCs to inform rate-making decisions under various budget constraints. Although this kind of analysis is difficult to do, given the significant rising costs for ratepayers driven by safety investments in utility systems, it is incumbent on us to get better analysis so that we can make more informed decisions. I will add that in my work with the National Association of Regulatory Utilities Commissioners, or NARUC, I have heard from fellow PUC commissioner colleagues across the country about a growing interest in many of the tools that we are using here in the risk-based decision-making framework and in the RAMP process to help decision makers weigh proposed safety investments costs. This work is challenging in large part because it is new, and I look forward to the discussion today to learn more from the parties, sending comments as to their ideas and their feedback on what we're trying to do here. I do want to take a moment to appreciate that the GRC process is a legacy that we have inherited to inform utility investments and the need to address costs that the system is confronting. Increasingly, we have had safety-driven costs impact the GRC process, and we've been adapting through the RDF, the GRC process, to accommodate our changing understanding of risk on the system and the need for safety investments in utility systems to maintain safe service. It's a critical part of the future of our utility systems, and these costs have real impact on the affordability of service for customers. So I really want us to collectively look at this proceeding as a venue for making the GRC process better for future generations of Californians, that we have more precise understandings of risk on the system, and the best way to mitigate that are attentive to the cost pressures that customers are facing today and will continue to face in the future. With that, I will conclude my remarks and hand it back to Eddie. Thank you.
Hey, Eddie, you're muted.
Thank you, Commissioner Reynolds. I said some really, really insightful words, but not as insightful as yours, I promise. No, I really appreciate that that introduction. I think it's a great way to get us started. And I'm going to shift us just a little bit to talk about our expected timeline for phase 4. We've already passed the definition of scoped work, and we're now moving on to this meaty subject here for this week, but we still have discussion scheduled in December and this should be track 1 of phase 4 for the risk mitigation accountability report, and so there will be information about that forthcoming. And then we're aiming to have a proposed decision on track 1 later. Sorry, that should be spring of 2025. I don't want to go back in time. And we will also be discussing phase 4 track 2 fairly soon. I will be issuing a procedural email describing a little bit about how we expect to go forward with track 2. So I just thought I would highlight that before we come to the main topics for this week. And what our expected outcomes are. as I mentioned earlier, the very beginning today we'll kind of have a short discussion about overall residual risk, and then we're going to be laying the foundation for risk tolerance today by discussing understanding or trying to get on the same page about the topics of probability distributions, and then also average and tail risk. So we'll have a recap of those topics later this morning. And then tomorrow, we'll be digging much more deeply into the topic of risk tolerance, and we'll be talking a little bit about the risk tolerance working group that would be established for setting risk tolerances for the people of California. And that's how it's framed within the proposal. And then also tomorrow, we'll do a first initial look at the concept of a portfolio, mitigation portfolios. But we'll leave a little bit of discussion for Friday to talk about simple optimization. And as I said, we'll have a pretty lengthy general discussion on Friday after. It'll still be Friday morning, but we'll have it that after that we discuss simple optimization. So the goals are really to try and provide feedback on whether or not the commission should provide guidance on these topics, particularly on integrating overall residual risk into the RDF, and requiring the utilities to make risk tolerance explicit in RAMP and GRC filings based on risk tolerances that are set within the risk tolerance working group. And then we'll be requiring, whether or not the commission should require the presentation of optimal portfolios in the RAMP or GRC filings. And we'll talk a little bit about what our approach is to optimization on Friday and how we see that going forward. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start with our first topic for this week, which is going to be on overall residual risk. And as I said, I'm going to kind of walk us through fairly, not all that quickly. I think we're going to have a lot of opportunity for discussion for each of these topics. And I think that, yes, Mike Gorman, I see you had your hand up. Would you like to?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on just residual risk and that the notion of risk tolerance and how rate affordability as a portion of these risks is being considered, and ultimately how would all of the risk assessments will be used in planning future general rate case filings on the utility. At the end of the day, if customers can't afford to pay the cost associated with risk mitigations, then the system simply isn't going to continue to operate. So
Mr. Gorman,
affordability is a major risk that needs to be discussed.
Sorry, Mr. Gorman, would it be okay if we first just kind of get through this slide, and then we'll allow folks in the Q&A session to kind of state their positions on these topics? Is that okay?
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with each of these topics. The staff proposal gets into some really meaty topics, and I just want to have a quick kind of overview of what we're discussing when we talk about overall risk reduction and overall residual risk, because it's fairly straightforward. I mean, we intend to require the utilities to include a figure and supporting work papers in the RAMP application, which would demonstrate the change of overall residual risk since the utility's first RAMP filing. And the overall residual risk would include all of the risk on the utility's assets or systems after taking account of the historical progress of risk reduction for every GRC cycle to date. And the figure here was actually created by a series of discovery requests by interveners in SCE's most recent GRC. And as we can see, SCE's overall residual wildfire risk reduced significantly after the 2021 GRC decision that resulted in the rollout of SCE's covered conductor program. In fact, there is approximately 25% of overall residual wildfire risk remaining, and it is crucial to keep in mind that as we move down this curve, the risk is more diffuse across SCE's electric grid. The risk is no longer concentrated in a small number of extremely risky assets, as was the case before, say, 2023. So as we move down the curve, reducing the bottom quarter of overall residual risk becomes less cost efficient, meaning we'll need to spend more money to continue reducing this portion of overall residual risk. And this is why the concept of risk tolerance is so important and is dependent upon knowing this overall residual risk number. Reducing risk to zero is virtually impossible and financially irresponsible. In order to address our current affordability crisis, we must have a process for determining if there is a level of overall residual risk that Californians are willing to accept. And that's essentially how we're trying to frame this initial discussion about overall residual risk, is that we just expect that when the utilities file a ramp, they can provide some type of figure as well as work papers that can describe the progress that's happening and has happened over time. And thank you, Mr. Gorman. Yeah, absolutely, rate affordability is definitely going to be on the list. I see that, Russell, you have your hand up if you had something that you wanted to discuss real quick.
Eddie, just a couple clarifying points. I do have a substantive point on this, but I want to respect the agenda and leave that for the discussion section.
Okay.
Just some clarifications on this. This is not an SCE doc. By the way, Commissioner Reynolds, nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. I'm SCE's GRC director, so I'm kind of close to this particular issue. So as you said correctly, Eddie, this is an extrapolation from data. So it's not SCE, it's not an SCE work product, but it is SCE data that interveners put together. And I'm not questioning its accuracy. I do want to note that the blue solid line is actual projects that have been instituted and the estimated risk reductions associated with those.
Mm-hmm.
And then the dotted line, especially in the outer years, are estimated hypothetical risk modeled projects and not actual scope, because of course we don't have actual scope for 27 and 28 for grid hardening. We discussed that a lot at the last workshop. I'm not going to go back through that again, but I just want to make those clarifying points. And then I do have substantive points on this, but I will save those for later.
Okay, great. Thanks,
Thank
Russell.
you.
No, I think those are valid explanations, and I think those are all accurate. I haven't heard anything that didn't make sense there, so I appreciate you pointing that out. Any other clarifying points or questions that folks had? If not, what I wanted to do was just present the basic language that we're asking to, or that we're suggesting, recommending to be added into the RDF so that we can properly address overall residual risk within ramp applications and allow interveners and staff to be able to evaluate the degree to which overall residual risk is being addressed. And we can come back. Yeah, oh, go ahead. Vincent, if you had a specific question about this language, please go ahead and add it.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious to kind of get a bigger picture of this risk reporting, because I'm kind of wondering whether reporting of overall residual risk is something that belongs in the RMAR instead. So yeah, just like to hear thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that we're also going to be discussing overall residual risk in the RMAR as well. And you know, we're saying that in a ramp application, it's important for us to have this information so that it could be part of the evaluation of the ramp as well. But absolutely, Vincent, you know, one of the keys is and I think that you can see that through the staff proposal, we'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow, is that it's really key that overall residual risk is made very clear and apparent, that the trend of reducing overall residual risk is made clear and apparent so that we can understand how we are approaching an acceptable amount of risk from the perspective of Californians. And so getting this you know, on the record and clear within a ramp application and then also within a GRC application is really important so that we can make wise decisions and make sure that the mitigations that we're investing in are helping us approach you know, our risk tolerance levels.
Don't disagree with what you said. I just kind of would like to get like an overall understanding of how the different reports in the different we're doing RCR, RMAR, GRC, how they all play together, right? So
and I think
that's more my point.
Yeah, sure. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next workshops in December. Once once you're able to see the approach that we're taking with the RMAR, I think it'll become a lot more clear that we're looking at this as a circular cycle between all of the reports, and that they are going to be interconnected and feeding into each other. And the RMAR in particular will be a document, or will be a report really that requires updating on a fairly regular basis. And then of course it would inform both the ramp and the GRC, because there you would be able to see how individual mitigations are actually reducing risk over time. With this picture, what we're looking at is how we're reducing overall residual risk for these specific risk events that are discussed and assessed within the ramp application. So I think it's very important actually that we still include this information in that application. Yeah, Dan.
Maybe just one quick, more clarifying question. I see maybe a contradict. First line, it says for every GRC cycle to date.
Mhm.
Is that intended to be going back years and years? Because the bottom language says since the utility's first ramp filing. So I'm wondering if maybe there was just a typo, or what the rationale is for maybe a difference in timing there.
Yeah, I think the goal was to try and make sure that the overall residual risk is measured as a result of the investments that come from a GRC cycle to date. But that's probably a good point. We can actually adjust the language so that it's a little bit more parallel, and that it mirrors the utility's first ramp filing. I think I would like to hear, though, a little bit from any of the interveners if they feel that there's a need to consider risk reduction approaches or methods that were taken before the first ramp filing. Does anyone have any thoughts about that? I see that Yumi has her hand up, but I'm not sure if that's in the context of this question. Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, go ahead.
Just quickly, yeah, I mean, maybe approximately, if it's easy, as sort of a descriptive paragraph or something with some charts or a graph, if it's not too difficult, because I think doing it accurately it may not even be practical, but just sort of giving sort of an order of magnitude sort of scale of here's what we did during the between 2010 and 2015. SDGD probably has a good showing in that. Could show sort of where were we at the beginning and where are we now. I think that would be interesting if it's, and I don't think, don't hold to a high accuracy standard, but just having a good feel for how that worked would be nice.
And maybe just as a thought, 1 second, Colin, this would be something that could be like a one-off where it happens in the next ramp cycle and doesn't necessarily need to be recreated in every ramp.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. And Colin, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, understanding the impacts of historical investments on, their ability to mitigate historical risk will better inform the investments in the current GRC cycle. And then being able to visualize this, I think, graphically will kind of aid in, stakeholders and ability to kind of interpret the level of reduction that's been done already and the amount of reduction that needs to be made going forward. So I think I'm kind of in agreement with this proposal here.
Okay, great. Yumi, I know you've had your hand up for a long time, but is it specific to this question? Because I have a feeling that Tom and Brian wanted to talk specifically to this question.
Yeah, this
go ahead.
So clarifying question on how this is different from test year baseline that we currently compute or required to compute under the ramp and GRC, right? It needs to currently account for the impact of the mitigation and control prior to the test year. So that's first question. And then second question regarding, it's related to your question. A lot of ramp models have been evolving since 2018, 19, since we first did the ramp. And most of the upgrades or refresh of those risk models are related to the data updates or improvements in the data quality or granularity. So it's not necessarily related to the risk models. So risk models are not static. It's dynamic and continuously being matured and improved. The data sources are not exactly the same as before. So how do you envision having this kind of charts in this transition period?
Yeah, I think that's a really valid question. Let me go to your first question, though, which is about the test year. The test year, of course, is going to be calculating only that value of risk for that year, and then the rest of that GRC cycle that you're assessing. It's not providing us a snapshot of what's gone on before and in the past. PG&E in its recent ramp has given us at least a little bit of data related to the current GRC cycle. And we've been able to see how your mitigations are going to be addressing the current GRC cycle. But we didn't get to see this kind of wide angle view that goes back to your pre-ramp period and be able to see the trend all the way to your current test year. So it is important that we're able to see the trend, I think, and be able to know where along the overall residual risk curve we're actually at today. So I think those are addressing two different needs in order for us to complete our assessments. So the second question about changing models is something that we're definitely going to address a significant amount within the RMR conversation, because we're going to be discussing the topics of backcasting and recasting due to potential changes in risk models. One thing that we're definitely going to require is that the utilities maintain the ability to recast their risk based on historical data. So if you're updating your model in a ramp, this table would be able, you would basically use your updated model to recap or kind of look backwards, essentially. But we would also need the ability to be able to compare what that looked like with your previous version, right? So that way we can see what is the change actually between version 1 and version 2, or version 2 and version 3. We don't want to disconnect. We need to have bridges between those models when they change to make sure that we understand exactly how the models are affecting the risk profiles. So I think that's it's going to be discussed in much more depth in the RMR chapter, or the RMR report that we're developing right now. But I appreciate the question for today. I think it's helpful for framing what we're expecting out of this particular visual in the work papers. Does that help answer your question, Yumi?
Partly. I'm still unsure how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, given that, like, let's say after one model update, the risk will be reset either by improving the data quality, or maybe the risk is actually higher than before, and there are mitigation impacts. And so how do we differentiate all of those? And I'm not sure whether we are able to, backcast, removing certain data. Yeah, so a lot of complexity that I am anticipating in creating this.
Yeah. I appreciate that, and we'll talk about it significant more. We'll have a whole section dedicated to that conversation in December. Tom, I believe you were next.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Long with Turn, just for people who don't know my affiliation. I think the question we're talking about is how far back we go with this graph, that, like the one that's shown on the slide now. And I can think of instances where it would be really helpful to go back before sort of we started getting doing ramps in earnest. And an example is gas transmission for PG&E. After the San Bruno explosion, there was an awful lot of risk reduction work that was done that preceded, I think, the first ramp. And we'd certainly want to take that into account in graphing the reduction of residual risk over time. So I don't know if that at this moment I have a suggestion on I'm dealing with Yumi's questions about feasibility. That's challenging, I understand. And any hard and fast suggestion about how far back to go, but I can certainly think of instances where it would be useful to go back before we started the ramps.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. We will think a little bit about some language that might help address that when we're kind of updating the staff proposal, because we do have the ability to make some slight changes before we file it next week. So let's see. Yeah, Brian, Dr. Landry.
Guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was having audio issues. Thanks, guys. I appreciate this conversation, but I just want to make sure that we understand what relative risk actually means. It's relative from a point in time and based on a certain set of models. One thing that's important is that the exposure is going to change over time. The input data, as Yumi said, is going to change over time. I could just imagine the nightmare of going back and figuring out what the vegetation was years ago. Climate change is going to make it change both in frequency and consequence in the future. Even the number of assets and population growth is going to change the consequence profiles. So I just want to be cautious about what the level of certainty we get out of this. And then also I want to caution against using relative risk versus absolute risk. So I could say as XYZ utility that I've reduced by 16%. I could be XYZ utility number 2 that says reduced by up to 16%. But one of them could have done nothing except cut one tree down, and the other one could have undergrounded the whole system. It's really important to capture the context of the exposure and the absolute risk here, because without that, this is a sort of meaningless metric. I'll also point out in the case of cyber, right? So cyber risk, they may show that it's increasing over time. Is that good enough compared to other risks, just by the very fact that you're going to have increase in exposure? So I just want to be cautious about how much gravitas we put behind metrics like this. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I just want to make clear, though, that providing a metric like this is actually still very important in order for us to have a valid and honest discussion about risk tolerance. I think that some of those discussions about relative and absolute are things that can be discussed once we get into the discussion about risk tolerance and especially when as if our proposal is accepted, the idea of having working groups where the utilities, staff, interveners can all come together to talk about those issues, I think is going to be, it'll be important. But I don't want to shy away from how equally important it is that we understand the trend within reducing overall residual risk and how it demonstrates whether or not we're approaching an acceptable level of risk from the perspective of Californians. So that's why we've presented this here. And
Eddie, very quickly, this is Russell Archer again. Setting aside the caveats that my colleagues have made, this model seems like it's intended to address essentially permanent risk mitigation investments, right? So this is specifically grid hardening, mostly almost exclusively covered conductor, but as it notes, fast curve settings as well. Those are essentially permanent investments, 40, 50-year investments. There's a lot of other risk mitigation that we do that we have to do every single year. And you're not making progress towards overall risk reduction. You're just sort of maintaining a flat profile year after year after year. So I think the commission staff, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, when they were thinking about this overall framework, was really focused on wildfire and really focused on grid hardening, which are important focuses, especially given the last 5 years. But I think we also need to be very cognizant that RAMP has a lot of different risks that may be very difficult to fit into this kind of a box.
But I think that if we're going to have risk tolerances, we're going to set risk tolerances for those other risks, you still have to be able to demonstrate that beyond the maintenance of your controls, you're still going to need to do some types of work that help you approach that risk tolerance level. And having this visual will be able to demonstrate the amount of work that you've been doing over time in order to reach that risk tolerance level. And so I'm not entirely convinced that it's strictly related to capital investments related to the grid or gas pipelines. But we can have a further discussion, especially if SCE or the other utilities are able to provide us with examples, like concrete examples with numbers, about what would be the difficulty in putting a diagram like this together for something like cybersecurity. I think that would be helpful for us to see in comments when you guys reply to our staff proposal.
Understood. Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you. Let's see, Chris, please.
Thank you. Chris Parks with Cal Advocates. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of how this historical progress can be used, one of the things that might be related to this is if we go back in time to the initial risk rulemaking, the commission adopted a CYCLA approach, which kind of like was a circular approach of doing risk assessment. And it would begin with looking at the risk, assessing the risk, looking at the mitigations, and at the very end would be an assessment of the actual results in risk mitigation. So to the extent the commission can get concrete data on the actual residual risk that has been achieved or lowered, let's say, and also with the performance of the risk mitigation programs back through time, not just forecasting what it will be, but have concrete data on what has been achieved. I think that will be extremely useful for the commission to evaluate alternative risk mitigations and the overall risk reduction that comes out of this process. To the extent that that data is available and can be used in this context, I think it would be helpful to be able to make those kind of assessments in justifying, between alternatives. So
Thanks.
That would just be my suggestion.
Thanks, Chris. Actually, I want to be mindful of the time. We're actually about 7 minutes over time. So Alan, Vincent, and Brian, could I ask you guys to just hold off on your comments on this, and we can come back to it in the general discussion? I'd like to shift us towards the next topic of probability distributions. And maybe when we get back to the general discussion, we can come back to some of these general questions, although I feel like we've actually talked through most of them already. Before we get into the process of determining risk tolerance, right, staff argue that the RDF must require utilities to be more explicit with how they calculate risk and the uncertainty around low likelihood and high consequence risk events, which is what we describe as tail risks. So we need to keep Californians safe by addressing the potential for these extreme events and tail risk. And risk tolerance can help us make sure that we address these extreme events, but in a cost-efficient manner. In phase 3, we already considered an approach on how to deal with tail risk in the context of wildfire. And we received a proposal from interveners, and then the utilities presented on approaches to deal with tail risk in a non-wildfire context. And in the first case, the commission adopted the one approach to tail risk that was associated with wildfire, but the commission was less convinced by the utilities proposal. And so Safety Policy Division hired an outside contractor, Level 4, who actually has joined us today. And they've recommended a follow-up approach to dealing with tail risks for all risk events. And that method actually integrates well with risk tolerance as well. And so the first step is requiring the utilities to move away from single number risk scores. And by that, we mean the utilities may take extremely complex models and condense them into a single number. And this is typically seen in an average or an expected value. But we also know that the utility may instead aggregate the tail into a single number, or worse, they just use the maximum as the single number to explain their risk. And eventually, when we start thinking about interrelated risks or cross-cutting risk factors such as climate change, then using a single number is really impossible. So we need to require the utility to use probability distributions and properly, and then when necessary to make those distributions more accessible to commission staff and interveners in RAMP and GRC applications. And the utility can still use these distributions to calculate averages, the median, or any percentile of tail risk if they wish. But for now, let's walk through a couple of examples related to probability distributions. So I think we're all fairly familiar with the fact that the utilities use complex modeling and simulations in order to generate calculations of likelihood of a risk event and consequence of a risk event, right? Those are our LOR and CORE scores that we talk about. And those simulations should be based on probability distributions across a large number of trials, which evaluators and interveners may need to review. In the first table, we see a set of 10 trials here, which could make up a probability distribution for like a hypothetical risk event. And we've represented LOR as a series of ones and zeros. So that just means that the risk event either happens or it doesn't. And each trial also has a simulated core, and we can multiply the core by the LOR to get the risk score for each trial. And we can take an average of each column, and then we can look at the tail risk, or the 90th percentile for core and for risk. And this is all accomplished through the arithmetic of uncertainty, which requires the utilities to maintain probability distributions throughout their risk assessment. And we can also explore this graphically in the figures to the right, where we can notice that while at the 10% probability level, the tail of core does have a data point between 450 and 600, risk does not. So the difference in the tail between the core and risk demonstrates why we actually need to maintain these probability distributions. And why we cannot use a single number, such as the tail of core or even the maximum of core, right? A utility may present a risk tolerance level that requires the mitigation of the tail of core and risk, but if the utility does not maintain probability distributions for public scrutiny, evaluators and interveners will really be unable to understand the implications of the tolerance level. And the arithmetic of uncertainty also helps to demonstrate the dangers of not properly aggregating tail risk. In this second hypothetical example, a risk analysis of 5 independent dams, right? They're independent, but they result in this 98th percentile tail risk values that are presented in this bar chart on the top right here. And this tail risk represents a 1 in 50-year event. Now, in a RAMP application, a utility may wish to provide an aggregated tail risk value for all of the dams in its territory. And that's allowed by the RDF, but there's a danger that of not maintaining the probability distribution. The proper way to aggregate the risk data would be to include all of the trials for all 5 of the dams into a table similar to what we saw in the previous slide. So you would include all, like if each dam had 10 trials, you would include all 50 trials together within the probability distribution. And so that would then we would take the 98th percentile of that entire probability distribution, and that results in a value of about $413 if we did it accurately. And in contrast, if we were to add up all of these numbers in this bar chart right here, we would be given a value of 762. This is in fact equivalent to the 99.6, sorry for that little wordage, but the 99.6th percentile, which is an extreme value that would only occur once every 250 years. So this would really overstate a tail risk by about 85%, and it really shouldn't be accepted as a valid value. And then I'm going to mention that we are presenting a few language suggestions for the RDF. I'm sure we're going to have quite a bit of discussion about this, and we're also adding in some additional languages to talk about probability distributions within the RDF itself. We have 3 locations where we're adjusting that language, so I'm happy to take some questions about that language and also to address some of the discussions that we're having in the slides. And I see there's lots of hand raised already. I just want to remind everyone that we're going to try to take a break at 11:15, and then we're going to come back and still talk a little bit about how to address this tail risk. So go ahead, Mark.
Hey, here it's Mark from PG&E here. So regarding, for example, the hypothetical dam safety, a key part of that is the independence of the distributions, right? So if you want to aggregate these, it's the dependent structure is going to be pretty critical. And, this notion of speaking to the dependent structure, how is that, addressed or ameliorated or related to the notion of risk tolerance, right? So it seems to be two different concepts. We can model risks that have joint distributions, but we don't, that doesn't necessarily tie to the necessity of looking at risk tolerance or a tail risk metric.
So we will be discussing in a future workshop a little bit more about interrelated risks and things like cross-cutting risk drivers. But at the moment, we're looking at tail risk from the perspective of the independence of these these dams, and there's definitely room to have that conversation in the future. But at least for the moment, we're trying to get a foundation for this type of a concept, and then how that's important for trying to get a tail risk measured that could be one of the variables that you address within your risk tolerance approach. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that after the break here. And so maybe that'll help clarify where we're expecting or how we're expecting tail risk to be addressed within our approach to risk tolerance. I did see Matthew raise his hand. Did you want to add something specific to that, Matthew?
Yes, I do. So thank you. I just wanted to acknowledge it, Mark, what you said is absolutely correct. If there was some level of interaction, interrelationship between the dams, that could change the arithmetic of uncertainty. But the key point is that the arithmetic of uncertainty would capture that. It just would have, the numbers would change. And we do want those interrelationships to be kept. And there are ways to do that. And as Eddie said, when we get to the subject of interrelationships, we'll go into that in much more detail.
But I don't think it should change the need for clearly addressing tail risk and how that could be addressed within risk tolerance.
Oh, right. No, it's still very important. It's just an extra wrinkle that would be added. The assumption of independence here was just to keep the example simple without having to get into the interrelationships. But you absolutely have tail risk when you have interrelationships, unless the interrelationship is perfect. If it's a correlation of exactly 1, then you can just add the 98 percentiles. But then that's probably a theoretical example only. It never really exists.
And Dr. Mitchell, did you have something that you wanted to add to this?
Yes, I did. Joe Mitchell, Musty Grade Road Alliance. Yeah, I'm not a dam expert, but I have studied tail risk and black swan events and that type of statistic quite a lot. And this looks to me like to be a very good example of the danger of applying standard statistics in the case of large tail risks and great uncertainty. Specifically regarding dam risk, I think we're primarily looking at climate change risk. If you look at some of the arc storm simulations that predict 1,000-year rainfalls becoming probable, I don't think our ability to reliably predict what a 50-year or 250-year event looks like really is very good right now. Somebody who's actually studied this might disagree with that, but I think the uncertainties are very great. Now, what Taleb, who's written a lot on this particular topic, suggests under the circumstance where you think your estimates are very unreliable and there's a potential for large tail risk, is in that case where you really don't have a good handle on it, use a worst case scenario as your standard case. And that would sort of, so you're saying, you said earlier that, well, this particular case would be too restrictive. You may want to rethink that if there is good evidence that you don't have a good handle on the certainties. That's what I had to say on that. Thanks.
Okay. I think I'll ask Dr. Landry or Brian if you wanted to add some comments to that.
Yeah, so just piggybacking on what Joe said, I think it's right. I think, you have to understand the expected value may be useful for things like benefit cost ratios, but it should not be the only data point. I'm not prepared to share what we're planning to do with our wildfire climate change analysis in the next WMP, but you'll read more about it in the next few weeks. I think maybe just a couple of clarifying questions. It seems like to do this properly, and I think, Matt, you mentioned this as well, is that you would have to almost have distributions at every single asset and then aggregate them up. Is that your understanding? So every single dam, every single flock, every single employee, every single cyber node to aggregate this up. Is that the correct way to think about this?
If you're asking,
go ahead, Matthew.
Not necessarily. Where you choose your kind of base unit of risk can vary. And, that's something that's a topic when we talked about RMR, we'll get into a little bit, but I use the Einstein paraphrasing, your unit needs to be as high as possible, but no higher, because you can't have probability distributions for every person, for every nut and bolt in the system. And so there's an art to that.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So one thing that I just want to bring up is just make that point. We'll have to be careful when we think about if you do something system-wide, and we had a discussion about this in phase 3, our concern is that you lose some of that spatial granularity. So it's an important part to understand that not all locations are going to have the same profile. I think I don't want to beat this to death a little bit, but it's an important point to keep in mind here. I think the second one is, maybe I'm a bit confused, but could you walk through, and this is more to the definitions on slide 20. I think maybe where my confusion comes in is that it seems like we're thinking about likelihood in terms of likelihood of the consequence, but not likelihood in terms of the failure mode, right? So if I think of this in terms of the risk bow tie, and one of my questions was to sort of ask you to walk through this and how this would work in a risk bow tie. You have the probability of a failure mode, a tree falling down, equipment failing. Then you have the probability of that occurring, of what sort of outcome that would be, right? It could be a big fire, it could be a small fire, it could be no fire at all, right? And then you would have the associated consequence. So it seems to me that the way this is set up, and again, I'm asking this question because I want to understand, is it seems like this is the likelihood of an outcome, but not necessarily the likelihood of a failure of that. Is that correct?
But could you clarify, Brian, does that mean that the likelihood of a tree falling, does that likelihood of, a failure, does that not also have a distribution associated with it, a probability?
It could, right? So it could, right. Exactly. So you could have 3 distributions, right? It's not just 2 in that circumstance.
I think that makes sense to me, and I don't understand why maintaining those probability distributions would be problematic, as long as you.
I'm not saying they are, but what I'm saying is that I just want to understand how you guys are thinking of this in terms of a risk bow tie, right? So you think of a distribution of failure modes, a distribution of outcomes, and then an associated distribution of consequences with those outcomes. Is that right?
And so So I think the key is that at least in the risk bow tie field, what we're specifically requiring, because this is necessary in order to calculate risk, right, is that we need
Right.
to have a probability distribution for the likelihood of the risk event and the consequence of the risk event. There's probably probability distributions that are behind those calculations, and it's important that you guys maintain those. But what we absolutely need is the probability distributions for likelihood of a risk event and the probability distributions that feed into consequence of a risk event. And then those should also, create a probability distribution of risk itself, correct? Sorry.
So yeah, just another clarifying question. So what if the probability distribution does not have zeros and one trials, as you described here? A lot of our distributions are based on machine learning models.
So I believe that there is a added line, might be in this presentation. I can't remember if it's today or tomorrow, where we do say that machine learning, is a valid data point that can be addressed.
So, but more specifically, what if it doesn't have zeros and one trials, as you describe in that line?
Brian, this is Matthew. Could you just clarify before I have an answer for you, but I want to make sure I understand. When you say it's machine learning, it doesn't have zeros and ones. What does it have? A risk event either occurs or doesn't.
Well, so it's like a PFM, so like a decision tree, right? So you think about a decision tree, then a gradient boosting with random forest models, to where it does associations between the different failure modes and weather variables, for instance.
Yeah, I think the general principle is any model you can extract the probability distribution you need.
Agree.
And
it's specific zeros and ones. So
yeah, and what I thought you were going to say is, if some of your models say they, you can have in certain risks multiple failures in the model, more like a Poisson distribution. Right. That can be handled as well. It just adds a little wrinkle to the consequence piece, because you can't use a single consequence, for 3 failures. You'd have to have 3 consequences for that, and that doesn't fit neatly into a column. But there are solutions for that.
And actually, my understanding, Brian, is that the utilities have already used those types of distributions when they're presenting their ramp applications, correct?
I'm not sure, because why would you need a distribution if you're using the expected value of employee safety, for instance?
Yeah, and you're collapsing all of those complex distributions into that single value, correct? And what we're asking for is a greater amount of transparency when it comes to how you're getting to that final calculation.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to talk more about this. I don't think that's exactly how our models are set up.
But you do have probability distributions for many of your risks, correct?
For many individual assets, that's correct.
Okay. And I think that essentially what you've been describing and talking about doesn't necessarily negate the importance of trying to add this clarifying language into the RDF, as far as I can tell. But you're welcome to try and explain a little bit more in comments.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. I'll defer my time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Let's see, I know Dr. Mitch was kind of chomping at the bit to try and reply to that, and then maybe I'll get to Vincent after that and Dr. Feinstein. So go ahead, Dr. Mitchell.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I want to put another layer on top of what Brian just said. I think this is important. A lot of failure modes have external drivers. And so your probability is going to be based on the probability of that external driver as well. So specifically, we've talked about wind and wildfire a lot. Extreme fire weather events trigger failures that can cause very large fires. And so that inserts a dependency. For dams, I talked about these arc storm events earlier. Your probability of reaching that failure mode is not random in time, but very much dependent on the probability of one of these extreme events. So I think there's another layer in certain cases where you have to think about any drivers that layer on top of your failure probability distribution. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Yeah, Vincent, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, about this level of prescription to use ones and zeros for our probabilities. I mean, like, I think like for us to do the modeling, we know what a probability distribution is. You seem to be kind of constraining us to modeling these probability distributions in this kind of simulation-based approach, right?
Okay.
Like, the other thing also, like, likelihoods, over here, we also use frequencies as in our calculations, right? We multiply frequency by call. We wouldn't keep the probability distribution as a ones and zeros, probably have a distribution. Let's say we could have a distribution for the number of events that happen every year. So I just find this language a bit constraining. I don't even think it's necessary, in terms of, requiring us to do probability distributions.
Okay. I appreciate that. And if you could provide some additional language that still, kind of encapsulates like the importance of probability distributions for likelihood, because it sounds like that's the holdup for this discussion is the probability distribution related to the calculation of lore. If you could provide that in comments, I think that would help us at least evaluate where the issue is and whether or not this language needs to be adjusted. So I appreciate that, Vincent. Thanks. Dr. Feinstein, please.
Hello. I think I've just unmuted myself successfully.
You're good. We can hear you.
Thank you. I have a question about the flaw of averages and what you mean to do when you think of that. What I'm concerned about is that we know from the theory of decision making under uncertainty that uncertain situation A is preferred to uncertain situation B if and only if the expected utility of A is greater than the expected utility of B. Now, the expected utility is an average. So where is the flaw? Or are you saying that what you propose to do is throw out everything we know about decision making under uncertainty?
Okay. Thanks for that comment. I'll let Matthew, if you wanted to respond to that, I think.
So Dr. Feinstein, you are correct under the assumption of risk neutrality. If that assumption doesn't hold, your statement doesn't hold either. And so if you are risk averse, then all of a sudden the rest of the distribution, including some notion of tail risk, becomes important.
That's completely false. Risk aversion has absolutely nothing to do with the theory of decision making. In fact, a utility function can be risk averse, risk preferred, or risk neutral. There are 6 axioms that mention nothing about risk attitude. So the statement you made isn't true. And what I'm concerned about is that the direction you're going is tossing out everything we know about decision theory.
Well, I don't think we're tossing everything, because we're not saying to throw out the expected value. What we're saying is it is important to consider tail risk in conjunction with the expected value. And I just don't agree that everything we say about decision science says that tail risk doesn't matter.
If I may. Sorry, Eddie. Yeah, if I may interject here, so I think, having, let's say, a concave expected utility or utility function, right, which then you then feed to an expected utility, that can account for tail risk by, virtue of the concavity, right? The certainty equivalent is going to be significantly, more than the actual lottery, expected lottery itself, right? So I think, I would have to reinforce Dr. Feinstein's point that the decision-making framework, right, and in particular the 6 axioms, these von Neumann-Morgenstern axioms, these are, pretty primitive axioms on rationality. And if you want to follow those, I mean, there are ways to incorporate aversity to risk and to tail events all within that framework. So what is the, what is the flaw there?
Let me go a little further, if you don't mind. What I'm concerned about is that there is implicit in this discussion of tail risk compared with the expected utility, a violation of at least one, and I think two, of the fundamental axioms. And so what concerns me is that the direction you're moving in is a direction that cannot be supported theoretically. You can make whatever computations you like, but you can't theoretically support them. And that's a problem I have with what I've been reading in these slides. I also have a problem with the last statement of the next slide, I think, where you say that risk, yes, just so, at the very bottom, please. Risk is the product of law and core and is represented as a probability distribution. I reject that. I understand that the consequences of a risk event can certainly be expressed as a probability distribution. No objection. The likelihood of a risk event cannot. That makes no sense. And risk itself is a number that you compute based on those probability distributions of core and the assessment you make about the likelihood of the risk event. And if that's not true, I'd like to know why.
Yeah, Matthew, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, so I understand your point about the probability, the likelihood as a probability distribution. And what we're really saying is it's the vector of zeros and ones. And the reason that is important is that vectors of zeros and ones allows you to understand when you have the likelihood of simultaneous risk events, which is a topic for the interrelationships discussion. But as you know, that when extreme events happen, it's almost never because of a single issue. It's when multiple things goes wrong. And so as risk managers, we believe that it's very important to understand when those multiple things go wrong. And that is what the vectors of zeros and ones allows you to do. Without those, it is simply impossible to understand the likelihood of simultaneous events. So that's really what that's getting at there. And if probability distribution isn't the right way of describing the vector of zeros and ones, maybe you can help us come up with a better way, but that's what that means.
I understand. Thank you for that explanation. I understand that the zeros and ones represent a sample path for binary events. For example, if one tosses coins. And then if you're doing simulations, which I expect is the direction you're going in, then the input to that had to have been the probability of getting a 1 or a 0. That's the expected value. We know this. So the zeros and ones don't particularly add anything. It's just an artifact of the computations you wish to make. The idea of multiple events seems to me to be readily addressable in the definition of the risk event. So I don't see what the issue is here.
One thing, though, if I could just add, Dr. Feinstein, if we have a driver that crosses risk events, don't you need to understand the probability distribution in order to understand how the interaction is occurring and how it's affecting multiple risk events at the same time?
If you're asking me, I will say that if I were solving the problem, I would define the event and then I would compute the probability based on the interaction of whatever drivers you might find in your bow tie or wherever they live.
So you would have to isolate the risk event.
But isn't that fundamental to what we're modeling? We're modeling a risk event. We're saying we have risk events that we're concerned about, and then we have to write down the probabilities of those events. And we have consequences that we're concerned about, and we have to write down the probability of those consequences. But while you're doing all that, we also have a fundamental theory that we ought not contradict.
Sure. I do want to be mindful of the time. I know that this conversation could continue for quite a bit. And actually, I know, Alan, you've had your hand up for quite a while. You also had your hand up before. And so I do kind of want to provide you with the opportunity to speak. And then Dr. Mitchell, maybe you could save your comment for the general discussion. Would that be possible? Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Alan.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate. I want to go back, piggyback on Vince's. These definitions. And now we have the opportunity to kind of clear up some things that kind of Vince brought up. There is that exposure piece that's been missing. So if you say, if you want to prescribe likelihood to be specifically a probability, which in general is not, right? And if you look at PHMSA's best practices, they put out a 2020 best practice of modeling risk from PHMSA. They clearly say that, risk is likelihood times consequence, and likelihood could be a frequency, probability, and such. So they give that. So for example, I'm thinking of excavation damage, right? System-wide excavation damage is it's not like a probability of it happening. It's happening multiple times in a year. So one way to address it, we could fix this language, is that lore is likelihood times exposure, where exposure is particularly like miles, for example, to address that missing piece. Because right now we have defined risk to be lore times core. And then we've said likelihood is specifically a probability. But we know that risk can be additive. We know on the right side of the equation, risk, you can add them, right? You have 3 risks, they add. So you look at the left side of the equation, and if you're very mathematical about it, you say, okay, so let's just say the consequence is equal, the same consequence, so I can factor that out, and I divide by. So what I'm forcing is the lores to be additive. But if we've defined the lore to be a probability, that can't be. So it forces itself back into a frequency or a rate. So I think if we just correct that by introducing exposure or loosening the saying that lore itself is a rate, we could fix that problem.
So exposure already is defined within the RDF. So I'm not sure that we actually need to add that.
Well, it's in these definitions, right? We have that risk is the product of lore and core.
Okay.
But we don't expressly say that it's a product of lore, core, and exposure.
Okay. Yeah, maybe you could provide some direction in comments on that.
And one more thing I want to point out, I know we left the slide, but I do agree with the math that you can't take the 0.4 and multiply it by the 90th percentile of the core and get the right number. That's totally but one thing that we want to make sure we do see, and is true, that if you're not working with tails, that the expected values work, right? So 0.4 times 200 is 80. So if you're doing all your math, if you're not going to deal with tails, that unnecessary computation is just burning electrons that we don't need to burn, right? So,
just to clarify, that the calculation of tail is still, it's voluntary. It's up to the utility.
Right, exactly.
So change that.
So maybe we need to give room for, hey, if it's not necessary, you don't need to go to that. The other thing is, as Vince mentioned, there's closed form solutions to things. If you have well-defined distributions, you don't need to do Monte Carlo. You could actually do convolutions and such. So it's good to not be so descriptive, but the math has got to make sense.
And we'll talk about that a little bit more once we get past the break. But Dr. Mitchell, I see you chomping at the bit. I'll let you have the last word before we go to a break.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I am. I just put something in the chat too. I don't see what the issue really is. If you got correlations between your likelihood and consequence, you can't just take the average of the likelihood and multiply it by the average of the consequence. You get your average by doing an integral over a sum of the product of the likelihood and consequence, and that gives you your nice risk value. That is, I think, what we want to have at the end. And I think the idea of storing probability distributions is that you can reconstruct that final calculated average at the end after doing all of the complicated stuff that you need to actually simulate the events.
Right. Thank you. I think we're going to jump to a break. We'll try to get back by 11, let's say 11:25. I think we'll just take a short break, about 6 minutes, and then try to come back, because I think there's still going to be a lot of discussion related to tail and average risk after we get back from this. So thanks. All right, I'm going to bring us back. We're actually at 11:26, so I gave everybody an extra minute. And I am going to first start us off by looking at average and tail risk, because we really want to hammer home this point that the utility can and should present its analysis through more than one number as a prelude to setting a risk tolerance, if that is the appropriate way to present it, using two numbers. And the two numbers that SPD recommends are average risk and tail average risk. And while I think everyone is pretty familiar with average risk, or the expected value that we just got done discussing, I just wanted to review some basic facts in order to come to like a shared understanding of tail average risk. Because as we've seen, a risk analysis creates a probability distribution. And here in this hypothetical example, we see a distribution for wildfire risk where all but maybe like 1% of wildfire ignitions result in less than, a $50 million of damage. This is just hypothetical. And this is in fact an example of a power law distribution that was discussed by Dr. Mitchell back in phase 3. In an ideal world, we would want to consider every point on the whole curve, but from a decision-making perspective, that is just infeasible. So a common simplification is to take an expected value or an average of the curve. But because this is a power law distribution, the average may not properly account for tail risk. So here we see three different approaches to dealing with the tail. The scaling approach shifts the curve to the right, raising the average of the curve. But the Commission has already expressed that the scaling function should be reserved for expressing the utility's aversion to risk and should not be used in tandem with an approach for addressing uncertainty in the tail of the risk curve. And we'll talk a little bit more about scaling tomorrow. So a second number that could be considered in addition to average risk is a specified percentile within the risk curve. For instance, in this figure, the 99th percentile is highlighted. And so please note that this value it ignores all the data points that are further down the curve, such as the maximum event at the very end, which appears to be like about 280 million. And that's an extreme event, but it's very unlikely to occur. And so there's a straightforward way to take it into account. We can take the average of all of the points within above a certain percentile. So in this case, it would be above the 99th percentile. And this average, this tail average, could then be a second number for decision makers to consider in its evaluation of a utility's risk assessment. And I'm sure we'll come back to that slide and discuss it a little bit more, but in this example, we see that that tail average would in fact be approximately 10 times the value of the risk seen in the average. And as long as the probability distributions are maintained, the utility can propose a set of mitigations that would reduce both average risk and tail risk in its models. So to review, the average includes the tail, but it gets drowned out by the rest of the data points on the tail. The rest of the data points above the tail. So the scaled average is basically an unclear use of the percentile approach, but the percentile approach ignores the risks above that chosen percentile. And so that's one of the reasons why staff are arguing that the tail average above a specified percentile, it doesn't necessarily need to be the 99th, but above that percentile could be an appropriate way to capture those additional points above that at the end of that curve. Oh, I think, Matthew, did you wanted to say something there? I thought you were going to come off mute. No? Uh-oh, Matthew might not be able to hear me. At any rate, I'm going to actually open this up for questions because we're also including some very detailed definitions for expected value, tail average, and tail risk, which haven't been added to the risk-based decision-making framework. And so that there's just clarity about each of these topics and concepts. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we are adjusting some of the language here within number 5, and I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts regarding this language. And if there's time, we can always go back to some of the additional slides, the previous slides, if there was questions that didn't quite get answered. And of course, as we start to wrap up today. We still have about an hour for discussion for all of these topics, but we'll focus this first half hour on this discussion between average risk and tail average risk, and then at 12 o'clock we can open up for general discussions on anything that was missed in the previous slides. Okay, so Brian, yeah, feel free to go ahead and ask your question.
Eddie, thank you for that. I think the language is good. I think I'm glad you added some definitions here for us to comment on, at least as a start. I think this has been a point of confusion that I know a number of parties have had. The other question I had is this, building upon what Dr. Mitchell said earlier, is that, we have to be careful about how wide the tail is in some of these distributions. If the tail is very, very, very long, and we're thinking about extreme values, yes, this one, we have to be careful that we characterize that. So I'd be cautious just to use, just to codify and make sure that it's prescriptive for all risk in the same way. Some risks may have different distributions. So I find the language interesting, and maybe we'll comment a little more about that.
And I think the language that we're adding, though, is that, can also be described using the tail average above a specified percentile, right? So
that's right. That's right.
It's not prescriptive in the sense that if there's a risk that has a nice bell-shaped curve and doesn't have the type of tail that is typically seen within a wildfire distribution, then it's up to the utility to determine if they want to present a tail average. Obviously, with a bell curve, I wouldn't understand why you would want to present that outside of expected value. You're more than welcome to address that, though, in your comments, and yeah, we can consider that further. Did anybody else have any additional questions or comments that they wanted to add? Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Hi, yeah, this is Tom from Turn again. By the way, it would be really, I don't know everybody. So people have been speaking and I don't know who they're affiliated with. So
I agree.
Really helpful if people would say their affiliation.
Thank you.
I just have clarifying questions. This is all very challenging material to someone who does not have a decision-making theory, statistics background. And so let me just ask some questions. Maybe we can start with slide 26.
Sure. Oh, there you go.
So you've got the whole curve, and then you've got a scaling function curve, which is different from the whole curve and shifted up in places. And then you've got this tail average. And then in the next slide, you have these different values that you get depending upon how you look at these curves. If you, and the scaled average is taking into account risk aversion, right? So that's
correct.
So we've accounted for risk aversion in the expected value when we do that. So then we get $41 instead of $7.
When you take the expected value of the scaled.
Yeah, when you take the
function.
expected value, right. Yeah. Now, when you're doing, I guess, if we can go back to the previous slide again, when you're doing the tail average, are we taking it on the original curve or the scaling function curve?
That's a great question. It's on the original curve.
Okay. And then if we're looking at tail average and making decisions based on tail average, which is, as you said a moment ago, it meant to be voluntary, but information that you're proposing be part of this decision-making process if people think it's useful. But if the expected values and the CBRs are based on the scaled average, haven't we already accounted for risk aversion in a very significant way?
So what we're going to discuss tomorrow is that the proposal is making a recommendation that the risk scaling function no longer be applied to the curve itself, but be applied to the exceedance curve. So our understanding of what is risk tolerance would be adjusted by our understanding of aversion. And so essentially it would shift our tolerance level down so that we would want to spend money to reduce risk down to that risk averse tolerance level. But we would not see the risk curve itself being adjusted by that scaling function. So the CBRs would be unscaled.
So the number two curve goes away.
Yes.
And then, but and as you say, we'll talk about it tomorrow. And I'm going to need help understanding what you're talking about, honestly.
Sure.
It's complicated.
Sure.
This shifting the exceedance curves. But that's just that. So we're gonna maybe we should defer this till tomorrow. Maybe you've answered my questions for now, and I appreciate that. So thank you, Eddie.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts on this particular topic, or do folks feel like they would rather spend time going back to some of the previous slides?
Eddie, I have a question. Yumi from PG&E. Many thoughts here. So if you could go to slide 28.
Yep.
One more. Yes, this one. So expected value is very common term in statistics, probability, right? It's generic term. So why does it need to be defined in here? And also I don't see the definition here is not correct, right? The sum of probability, it needs to be, the all values, sum of all values weighted by probability. This is to me,
at the same thing, or weighted by outcome. That's right.
Yeah, this is unusual definition for expected value. And the same goes to tail average. It seems like these two bullet points are trying to describe how it should be calculated rather than what it means. But there are many ways that this could be calculated. If you have analytical, if you have distribution, you can compute or you can calculate the tail average using analytical formula or closed form solutions, right? So that's one comment.
But I think the goal here is to try to create more of a uniform approach to the way that these values are calculated.
So let me get to this. So then so going back to 1 or 0 and tail average. So for tail average, one thing that we in the past tried to implement, but we didn't do, was tail average requires, annual, like some time period, right? Some time period, and you want to look at the risk as a total for the system. So let's say wildfire risk. If you were to simulate each individual circuit segment with its likelihood, like 1 or 0 for each individual circuit segment on whether ignition will happen or not, within the year, that probability will be really, really small. 1 will not be generated, even with maybe 10,000 simulations. So you will need to do a lot more simulations. And we found that as you go more and more granular, it's going to be more and more rare events. And so 1 or 0 simulation will be very inaccurate and very inefficient. So that's one issue. The other issue is that it may not be practical enough because if you were to tail average, it's not additive, as you pointed out, right? So let's say you make some mitigations in one circuit segment, then you will have to simulate that one and then combine with the rest of the system to look into what's the impact on total risk. It's not necessarily just driven by the impact on this circuit segment. It's dependent upon what the rest of the system is doing in the final tail average estimate. And so it gets really convoluted, and it's not easily it's not computationally, unless you do like very heavy simulations. It's really hard to see the impact of one circuit segment in the total system tail average.
So
right?
maybe I think there's two parts to this discussion that you're creating, and maybe I'll have Matthew answer the last part. But I think that the last workshop we had a pretty robust discussion about the risk reporting unit and thinking about what's the right granularity for a mitigation to be presented within work papers and within a ramp. And I think that when the utility is creating their risk models, they also need to be cognizant of what's the right granularity for running their simulations. If you're running your simulation at a really fine granularity and it's not producing accurate or extreme, or if it's producing really uncertain results, then that's probably a problem. And I think that should also show up within your transparency pilot when you're running sensitivity analyses as well. Is that right?
I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think what Yumi said, so once again to the point, right, we shouldn't let any technologies that one might have in mind dictate the solution. I think what Yumi is saying basically is that yeah, there's uncertainty, but the way it's written, the way the language that's written is going to kind of dictate us to use a solution that perhaps doesn't solve the uncertainty that she's talking about. You asked me earlier about what language we need to perhaps change instead of having ones and zeros in the distribution. And what I looked at, and based on some conversation that we had earlier, Dr. Mitchell was saying that maybe ones and zeros are needed to reproduce the values so that they're repeatable. There are many ways to be repeatable in to do these kinds of modeling. There's many ways to have repeatability, right? There's many ways to have reproducibility. The RDF as it stands, R.29 already requires IOUs. I can read it to you, R.29, right? Just from the middle of it says the methodologies used by the utility should be mathematically correct and logically sound, should be transparent. All calculations should be repeatable by third parties using utility data and assumptions. So it's like, I think we already have that without the necessity to dictate how distribution should be stored, should be created, should be calculated. So that's
if we already have that, then specifying this probably shouldn't make much of a difference.
Well, I think
is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that I think that since we already have that, we don't need to go into the extra detail that might. Why do we need to store things as ones and zeros? As Dr. Feinstein alluded to, we already have the probability distributions from which the ones and zeros came from. That's good enough. Likewise, why do we need these kind of why expected value should be divided by the count of values in the very simulation-based approach.
Yeah.
And it's like not we do simulation here too, but sometimes we do closed form as well. Sometimes we use a mixture of both. Right? I think if you would take a strict interpretation of this, it would preclude us from doing what we're doing now.
And I'll let Matthew answer some of that, but I might have a follow-up question to what you just said. But go ahead, Matthew.
Okay. So there's a whole bunch of points that have been raised between Yumi and Vincent. And so pardon me if I don't quite address the ones you want, you can, and feel free to follow up. The first thing you were talking about with the tail average, or really pretty much any of these tail measures on being computationally difficult. I actually say they're, if anything, they're elegantly simple. If you have all your risk vectors and you change one, you don't have to rerun everything. You just plop the new vector in and add them up again. And the key point is that you take, when you do your average calculation, whether it's expected value or tail average, is you only do it on the total. You don't do it on the individual components. And so you're not actually having to do a whole bunch of new calculations, just one. And that's a really important point when you talk about and understanding the arithmetic of uncertainty and how you manipulate these probability distributions. As far as to Vincent's point about, well, do you really need to keep the zeros and ones separate? No, I think as long as we know we're doing that, and you're not just, if you have a likelihood of 10%, you're not just multiplying your consequence probability distribution by 10%, which would very much understate your tail risks if you did that. If we knew that the zeros and ones were behind the calculation, then sure, the risk calculation would show us that, because your vector would be a bunch of zeros, which would represent your zero cases, and the positive numbers would represent all the one cases. So, I think you're right. As long as we know that the math is being done correctly, you would not literally have to preserve lots of vectors of zeros and ones, if that answers that question. I'm going to stop because I know that it's possible that you guys were saying something slightly different.
I actually had other questions on another slide, but I want to see if you mean is okay with this first before we go on.
Yeah, I think I'm still unclear. I know what you're saying. If you look at it from maybe entire risk as a whole, and then let's say the event happened with some probability, you simulated 1 and 0 and look at the impact on the tail for annual loss, let's say annual loss.
Yeah.
But like, is that really effective or practical way to implement for asset management or operational risk management? Because there are a ton of mitigations if we count each mitigation at the asset level or risk reporting unit, which we are trying to go granular, right? With that context, it's easier or more allowing risk-informed decision-making if we were to able to separate out each individual calculations at that level, rather than having this change in one part of the system. We'll have to see what's happening in the rest of the system in order to see the impact of this to the overall tail average. For example, like if we were to currently use the risk values, scaled risk values, it's all additive. And so we will know by looking at just one particular, let's say, risk reporting unit or trend. If we change the risk by a certain amount, we know total risk was changed by the same amount. And it's easy to do mitigations or planning or looking at the impact of doing certain things very disaggregated way. However, if we were to combine the metric, depending on how you combine, if you combine into one trench versus a different way of trenching, and then when you do the system, or when you aggregate all of the risks in the enterprise into one risk, tail average will need to be recalculated, and not necessarily translating a risk reduction in one risk will be the same reduction in the total risk. because it depends on each individual probability distribution of what the others are doing, and then aggregate it into the annual number, and then see what the impact should be on the overall. So when you're aggregating things together, the tail average is really challenging to operationalize, in my opinion. And so, was there any examples that are any other companies that are using this approach enterprise-wide for all of the asset-based operational risks in the company? Because I don't see clearly how that's going to help decision making if we are trying to have all of our mitigations and controls to have to see the value in how it's reducing the total risk.
The tail risk, the tail average risk.
Yeah.
However, the risk is measured. Yeah, tail risk.
So yes, I think, Eddie, there is something here. I feel like part of what Yumi is talking about is the continuum or the transition between planning models and operating models, and we're really talking about planning models here. You know, I don't think the idea is that when you go into detailed operations that you're running simulations on, you know, each individual mitigation. That's not really the objective here. Yumi, you are correct that the tail risks are not additive, and if you're doing a bunch of individual mitigations that affect the tail, it's not clear on, well, when you roll that up, what happens. And again, that's not really what we're talking about. We're saying when you're talking at this level, you're talking really at the system level. You know, this is your set of mitigations and how you're reshaping your pre-mitigated risk curve, your inherent risk curve. And you know, I don't think that we're really that interested in you know, the tail risk of each individual mitigation on its own. I don't know if that helps you. I think it is an important point that you're making, and Eddie, we'll have to think about how to communicate, you know, what we're talking about kind of at the system level or at the risk event level, as opposed to how you look at individual RRUs, you know, the distributions of that, because it's not the same thing.
But I think we do talk about it when we unpack the concept of portfolios, because I think essentially once you have all of your risk mitigations integrated into a portfolio, and then you look at how the portfolio itself is addressing tail risk, not how each individual mitigation is addressing the tail risk, and addressing and calculating out a tail average. Because ultimately what the goal is, which we'll talk about tomorrow, is that we see the tail average as being one of the decision-making points that a decision maker would want to be concerned about when it comes to risk tolerance. That Californians do have a certain amount of appetite for average risk, but their appetite for tail risk may be slightly different. And so once you have a portfolio of mitigations that can address that tail risk at a high level, that can be part of the calculus. It can be part of the estimation. Does that make sense, Yumi? I also understood what you were trying to say, and I think that the portfolio direction helps address some of that concern, actually.
Well, in fact, I'm more confused. So I don't think that optimization will work with the tail average then. So we can get to it maybe in the next workshop. But when you talk about the optimization, but as I said about like the impact of one mitigation to the total tail average metric is not directly, additive, right? So then how would optimization will work in a simple way unless you include all of the simulation result and the mitigation impacts into the optimization, which will be
we'll talk about that at quite a bit of length, I think, on Friday, and we're going to have dedicated, discussion time to talk about optimization on Friday. So I think we'll probably.
But the good news is that it has been proven that you can optimize tail average. So we'll show you that, but just so you aren't wondering for 2 days, it is a proven thing. So.
And Brian, did you want to add?
Yeah, sorry guys, my points cut out, but Yumi has made and Vincent have made some eloquent points. I think it's important points that we made here is that what I think you guys are contemplating are sort of system-wide values, and then disaggregating them back down to the system. But Yumi is sharing the same concerns that I have, is that to do this optimally for an optimization function, which is what you're showing later on, you really have to do this for every single asset and then aggregate them back up somehow. And these averages are very, very small. And I can give you an example from wildfire. There's 4 ignitions that have been catastrophic in Edison's territory of the last X number of years out of all the total ignitions. So that's very small to begin with. And then to disaggregate that amongst a whole bunch of different assets, you're talking billions of trials that would have to occur and then aggregate them back up. So there are simpler ways to kind of do this, and I won't belabor that much more. The other point is, if you take other industries that have done this, the Corps of Engineers, for instance, they do these optimization functions on every individual dam for every individual asset and every individual failure mode, and it takes an extensive amount of time to do this. And then there's still uncertainty within the expected value, and there's uncertainty where I think Yuma is pointing up within the tail value, because the tails can be very, very, very long. You can have one point at one end of the tail and then many points at the other end of the tail. So if you weight those averages, you're going to bring those back. And I'll give you a good relevant example. If you were to weight the average simulations across the campfire, you'd miss the campfire. If you'd weight the average tail values across the Woolsey fire, you'd miss the Woolsey fire. If you'd average them across other fires that we've had along the coast, you would miss those completely. So what you're doing is, if you're reducing the spatial granularity of our risk models to satisfy a system-wide optimization function. So I want us to be very cognizant that you're making a trade-off between a theoretical system-wide exercise and actually mitigating the risk of your system. And I'll stop there because I know I don't want to take any more time.
Okay, thank you for that, Brian. I think I'm going to open it up actually for like some general comments that we can either continue the discussion on any of the 3 topics that we've addressed today. If there was, I know there were actually a couple of comments from the previous slides that maybe folks didn't get a chance to make comments on. And if you would like to do that now, you're more than welcome to. We still have half an hour where we continue this discussion.
Yeah, I was going to get started. I think we should go back to maybe slide 25.
25?
Yeah, the 25.
That's the green slide.
Oh, 26.
Oh, 26. Oh, so you still want to stick with average risk? Okay.
No, well, just bringing up a point, bringing up a question. Basically, it's like, I think we're all moving. The reason you're showing us this is because we're moving to some kind of risk tolerance expressed in dollars, right? Is that the point here?
Well, I think that's
talking about.
That's actually one of the questions that one of the planning questions that we included was, you can express risk tolerance in a dollar value, but you can also express it in terms of natural units. And so we're looking for input on that. But yes, we've at least, most of the hypothetical examples that we've discussed within the staff proposal is using risk tolerance at a dollar value.
Yeah, it seems to be implying that. And my question was, why do we want to do it that way, right? I mean, when you talk about risk tolerance, you talk about return periods. I think it's easier to understand, to express to a wider audience risk tolerance in terms of natural units. How often does a catastrophe? How often do you want a catastrophe to happen, right? How do you define catastrophe? Was it 1 in 100 years, 1 in 1,000 years? Expressing it in dollars, like, well, first the dollars change. So it's like, and then it's not a natural thing to talk about equivalent to $1,000.
And I think, though, that Vincent, one of the issues is that when you're looking at your portfolio of mitigations, you're still going to need to convert that risk tolerance value into some type of a dollar value so that you can understand, how much money you're spending on these mitigations and how much risk you're actually reducing, how much of that overall residual risk that you're actually reducing. And so there's probably a translation that's going to need to happen. But there could be space and room for presenting risk tolerance in terms of, natural units as well. I think that that's something for the working group that we're going to discuss tomorrow to also work through. Tom, did you have something that you wanted to say specific to that? Or did you have another question?
I had a different question. This is Tom from Turn. Should I go to that or do you want to stay on this topic?
I think you can go to that.
Okay. Mine was on slides 12 and 13, back to residual risk.
Oh, okay.
Maybe not 13, 11 and 12, maybe.
12, this is the
anyway,
diagrams.
So this one, and what I'm interested in, I guess it is 13. You use the term overall residual risk, and I'm trying to understand what the intent is with that.
Yeah.
Is that intended to mean aggregated across all risks of the utility?
It's intended to mean the overall residual risk for a risk event. Basically what we're saying is that for the output of step 2A, which is that's a list of all of the different risks that would be included within the ramp. They would need to provide a diagram with supporting work papers for each of those risks. So it wouldn't be a high level risk number. And that's why the diagram that we present here is strictly just wildfire.
So the intent would be to have this for each risk that's presented in the ramp.
That's right.
Would there be something for other risks, or are you proposing that this is just limited to what's in the ramp?
You mean risks outside of the ramp filing?
Well, as you know, there's a pairing that happens, a pairing process that happens.
Yes.
Utilities have many risks in their risk register, right? But they don't have, there's a cut that
there
happens.
Is.
And so this is a clarifying question. I'm trying to understand what you intended by this, or maybe you hadn't.
Yeah, we intended that it would be the risks that were submitted to the ramp. But if there's a justification for, adding additional risks outside of the ramp context, you could definitely put that into comments and try to help us understand what the benefit of that would be.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Eddie, this is Russell Archer. I have a comment on this particular slide, so this may be appropriate. I don't want to jump anyone in line. And if Mr. Long doesn't have advanced degrees in this stuff, I didn't even graduate from kindergarten. So take that for what it's worth. But when we're talking about this concept of residual risk, I think it's really important to consider the absolute scale of the risk that you are trying to mitigate, and that the risk pool at the beginning and the risk pool that is left to be mitigated in absolute terms. For example, if the 100% on this graph represented 10 potential paper cuts, then reducing that risk by 84%, everyone would agree, good enough. If the 100% on this graph represented 1 billion lives lost in a global pandemic, I think we'd all probably agree that 84% risk reduction is not nearly enough. So the absolute function and scale of how much risk is out there and how much risk is less is really important, which I think is consistent with Tom's earlier comment about you need to really do this separately for different risks. Yeah. Because wildfire risk and other risks look very different from an absolute perspective.
Yep. I don't disagree. I think this is intended to be for different risks. Yeah. Matthew, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah. So this issue of relative and absolute has come up now 2 or 3 times, and I think we completely understand, we completely get it, and in general we will be asking for both. And in this case, it would be all you need to do is add two numbers. You in addition to the 100%, you could put the absolute starting level. And at the end point, you for the residual risk, you'd put the ending level, absolute level, and you'd solve the problem. You would instantly be able to see the difference between 10 paper clips and a much more serious risk. So we agree it's an easy solve.
All right, thank you for that clarification, Matthew.
Yep. Let's see, Alan, I know that you had a question. I think it's from before, maybe not on overall residual risk.
Yeah, hi, Eddie. First of all, I just want to introduce myself since Tom brought it up, and I forgot if I did. Alan Petulli. I am a quantitative risk manager at SoCal Gas, and have a PhD in mathematics. And nice to meet you, Tom. So just overall, practicality is very important because we do things theoretically and say it'd be nice to have this graph, and we did talk about it, Eddie. Like, for example, we have these models that have been developed, integrity management, let's just say, and that model failure rates, right? And these models are new models. They're machine learning models, whatnot. They didn't exist back then, right? And to backcast, it's almost like you make the craziest assumptions, and what do you got from inside out? So it's not just the methodology that Yumi mentioned. Yeah, the methodologies have changed. We're now doing cost benefit ratios with dollars and before with national units. It's not just that, it's the models that were used to calculate things that didn't exist before a certain time. So we got to be practical. Practically speaking, probably realistically, it would be nice to start something like this now forward rather than trying to go backwards in time. That'd be probably more realistic, and the numbers would be actually useful rather than there's so much uncertainty in them. Do I even trust it? Do I trade on that number? Something like that. Yeah.
One of the issues, though, is that if you started from now, would you be able to properly capture the amount of risk reduction that you've already achieved? And how would an outside entity be able to verify that?
It might be a function of the risks themselves, Eddie. I don't know. And the other question is that was brought up. Some of the risks didn't exist, right? Back in the past, or they were in ramp or not in ramp, or they weren't exist. So those have to be clarified, right? Like, what are we talking about? So those are. But generally speaking, the two things I would just want to close with is we've got to be careful that what's practical. I think a lot of stuff Yumi was talking about was practicality of things, and not be so prescriptive to leave room for innovation and better practices. To be very descriptive, to say you Monte Carlo it and you take the simple average, and that's going to be the expected value, stuff like that. We know that that's a very corner case. We just want to be mindful of not being over prescriptive, but making sure that we are doing the math correctly. I totally agree with that. The math has to be correct, but just be less prescriptive and leave room for innovation and better practices.
And I want to maybe address one thing that I think that I'm hearing, which is that part of the concern is that the data isn't there to support the math, essentially. Is that part of the concern? Because I think one of the issues, and this got brought up in phase 3, is that the utilities have had a great deal of time to be able to collect the data that they need in order to present very clear and accurate risk assessments in their ramp, their GRC, and that was actually required by the RDF. There's been multiple instances where the commission has ruled that the utility needs to do the proper data collection in order to, assess these risks in a transparent way. And so, if the concern is that the data isn't there, then I think that's a bit of a concern. I think, at least from SPD staff's position, because you've already been, given a great deal of time in order to collect that data. So I know that actually next month, we're expecting the utilities to present a report essentially about their upcoming data collection activities and what they're intending to do over the next few years in order to, meet some of these expectations with regard to data collection. So I just want to make sure that you guys take that opportunity very seriously and like explain where your data is missing. And I think that's because in my understanding is that the utility should have been able to collect that data by this point and be able to address many of these methods that we're discussing here. And so if there's other justifications outside of the data issue, then that would be something that I think would be important to discuss within your comments. But I'm not sure if the data issue is the right approach to show concern.
I wasn't speaking about the data issue. There's some sophisticated machine learning models that use data to come up with probabilities. Those didn't exist back. For example, they may have not existed back in 2018, or we're even talking about going further back. So what do you do in that sense, right? Like, do you spend a lot of capital to rebuild the model as if it existed back then? These are the questions to be asked.
Sure, and we're going to talk about that during the armor.
Okay,
as well.
and to Yumi's point, when you have down in the little segment, just to say it again, this vector of zeros and ones are Bernoulli trials, right, Matthew? So you're talking about if you have a probability of 0.000001, if you do a Bernoulli trial, like 10 trials, you're going to get zeros. If you do a million trials, you're going to get mostly zeros. So that's where I just want to bring light to that. To really capture the vector of ones and zeros, to capture that probability, you're going to go into the millions, of simulations. And those store, and it's just a lot of computation. Practicality is where I'm talking about. We got to just be careful of practicality. So maybe there is definitely better ways to do that than doing this prescriptive method. Just that's what I want to be careful of, to be so descriptive that you have to do it this way, and there's other ways to do it that are not as computationally expensive. And then so yeah, Matthew.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah. Hi. So we are definitely interested in computational effectiveness and have some thoughts on how to manage. Because you're right. You could be talking about millions of trials per simulation. So that's definitely I think a topic of open discussion. And as far as the backcasting, we've sort of assumed that in most, if not all cases, the models are built based on using decades of data, and so therefore going back 10 years would not be a problem. But to the extent that we have situations where that's not the case, we'd be very interested in learning, what data and what models that have only been around for a few years the utilities are using, because that's we just like to understand that better. So very open to keeping that an open line of communication.
Yeah, and so that's a really good point that I think that we, that should definitely be something that's addressed within comments. But, I think that the goal is to be able to try and find a solution within the language that we presented here, so that that it provides a universal approach that can be used within the ramp. And there is a certain amount of flexibility that the utilities have been given already, and we just want to make sure that the level of flexibility that the utilities are asking for is properly justified. So when you present those examples, make sure that they're really spelled out pretty clearly. And because if they're not, it's very difficult for us to understand, like, what's the justification for not prescribing something that makes it very easy for staff and interveners to do their evaluation of your ramps. if there's a single way for us to understand that, then yeah, that can make things much easier. So it just needs to be properly justified when you provide us with those types of examples. Chris, yeah, I see. Or Matthew, did you have something else that you wanted to add to that? Or? No, just a legacy hand.
Yeah, Chris Parks from Cal Advocates. Yeah, so I think that would be very useful if they're presenting examples on how they've done. So I think that utilities would be evaluating the effectiveness of their risk mitigation programs. That is expected, right? And so however they evaluate the effectiveness of those programs and can demonstrate the risk reduction, I think that that's going to be very helpful to the commission to understand the risk reduction from the past, however they did it and however they evaluated it. It's like a key step in that cycle I mentioned earlier of risk mitigation is that it's key to be able to go back and evaluate the effectiveness, because that would be critical information for proposing or assessing continuing or alternative mitigation measures.
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes it really important that we understand what level of risk reduction has already been done so that we can understand, have we already gotten to a level of risk that's acceptable to Californians? Have we approached a risk tolerance, essentially? And I think that's part of the ask that's coming out of this particular part of the staff proposal. So thanks. Yeah, Yumi, go ahead.
Sorry for many questions here. What I just want to ask on that last comment, why do we need to understand the historical progress of the risk like this graph in order to know whether we have approached tolerable level? Don't we just need to look at the current level of the risk and compare with the risk tolerance to get that answer?
But we do need to know the trend that's been happening over time, because there's a couple of reasons for that. One is about cost efficiency, right? Essentially, as you get further down the curve, it's going to cost more to reduce that bottom part of that curve. And so that's a big part of the calculation and the calculus for determining how we should be prioritizing certain types of risk investments.
But we can see that in the cost-benefit ratios already, right? I mean, like if you see the diminishing returns, they were short there. And then number two, I think Yumi's point is basically it's like, yeah, you want to see how your performance in the past, but I also find it kind of odd that our risk tolerance.
Yeah, there's another part to this though, Vincent. There's another part to this within the RMR is that we also need to hold the utilities accountable for all of the money that they've spent reducing risk in the past. I get that. We need a baseline on that before we can start talking about how you continue to reduce risk in the future.
I kind of get that, but I kind of find it odd that our risk tolerance is based on, it should be based on where we stand right now relative to where we want to be. And I'm kind of curious that the trajectory of how we got to where we are right now applies to risk tolerance, specifically to risk tolerance.
It frames risk tolerance. It's not part of the calculation necessarily, but it helps provide perspective about how we're approaching the level of risk tolerance. Think of it this way, Vincent. If you could also plot a risk tolerance line on this graph, correct? You could say that at some level, we have pretty much already started to approach that level, and it gives the decision maker the ability to see how long it's taken to get to this particular level and how much further we have to go. And I don't think that it's actually a particularly large ask, because and not only because it's not a huge ask in this particular context, but also because we're going to be needing it within the context of the RMR in order to be able to understand, have the utilities been accountable for the investments that they've made, and have they reduced the amount of risk that they've said that they've made? You're going to be able to need to provide us with an understanding of what happened in the past.
When you say plot the risk tolerance on this graph, I mean, what particular measure of risk tolerance are you using?
That's for the risk tolerance working group to decide once they get to that level. My point is that you could try to understand where a level of risk, where you're at within your risk tolerance. And, you know, obviously when we were at our pre-mitigation level, this value of risk tolerance, or this value of risk, was much higher than what the state of California would desire risk to be at. And so this graph actually tells you how you're getting closer to that level of risk tolerance over time. This doesn't necessarily have to be a percentage, right? It could also be expressed within dollars or natural units, as you expressed before. It just depends on how you want to present this graph. But what we need is a understanding of how overall residual risk has been changing over time in order to understand whether or not the utilities have, you know, been addressing the risk that we wanted them to over that period of time.
Yeah, I still kind of think I agree that's relevant, but I think it's relevant from an RMAL standpoint, you know, seeing whether we've been accountable for and efficient in our implementation of mitigation. Still not clear to me from a risk tolerance standpoint, because I can see where we are right now, where we get the cost benefit ratios that we haven't had will tell us whether it's worthwhile getting there.
Sure.
So it's still very unclear. I
Okay.
leave it at that.
Okay. Let's see. Brian, I think you have your hand up first.
Hey guys, so I think what I'm hearing over and over again is, hey, you're going to know more when we talk about RMAR. So maybe we can table this discussion when we know more about RMAR, because as you can hear from all the parties here, we're just confused as to the real materiality of this. And I get your point, Eddie. There seems to be a master plan that we're not aware of here. But could we table this when we talk about RMAR? Is that potential?
Yeah, we can. I think so. I just want to make
Okay.
clear, though, that the concept of overall residual risk is very important to risk tolerance. The historical piece to that, I think that the trend actually is still important for understanding where we've been and where we're going. But certainly the measure of overall residual risk is very important for for understanding, have we achieved a risk tolerance level? And so part of this was an attempt to try and provide us with the definition of overall residual risk, but it's also an attempt to note that, I do believe that this is important information within the ramp, within the ramp evaluation, and I'm not certain that it should be limited to just the RMAR. And we can have that discussion, though, after we discuss through the RMAR and see how folks feel about it at that point.
I got a quick
that'd be helpful. I think just one more thing on this. So I think the confusion is how this is going to be used, and I understand you're saying it's in risk tolerance, but I think my concern is that if I say we've reduced wildfire risk, I'm going to say it to 10%, PG&E says to 10%, and San Diego says to 10%. We're all different sizes and entities, right? So it's that 10% means different things. So you can see our concern beyond the technical nature of this.
Yeah, sure. And I think that we can address that, especially when we're discussing this within those kind of working groups that are discussing risk tolerance in specific. But I see that
Thank you very much.
Would like to jump in here with a comment. So please.
I was gonna just add into like what Eddie was saying. I think like the part of the point of this is to try to tell the story of what happened in the past, and this plot really tells, say, like a non-technical person where we started, where we are, right? And so on some level, I hear some of the arguments that we just kind of went through, but I also think that the goal of this is to make this accessible, right? And I think like this chart really helps a less technical audience understand the journey that the utility has been on, where they are, where they're going, where the risk tolerance wants to be. And I think it really contextualizes it, and it makes it understandable in a way that just looking at a 3-year period or 4-year period, you kind of lose the forest from the trees. And I think ultimately, a big part of this entire effort, right, is to make this information more accessible, right? And so I think that's one really important perspective here is we want to come up with ways to broaden the accessibility of this, really complex work. And I think that's part of the reason, part of what Eddie's talking about with this residual risk. I just kind of wanted to expand on it really quick.
Thanks, Henry. Appreciate that. And I think it captures a lot of why I think this is still important within the ramp structure. Let's see, Dr. Mitchell.
Yes. So I think residual risk is an important input to risk tolerance, but it isn't the whole story, because the issue of cost injects a lot of personal risk to a lot of people who can't afford their bills, which is distributed over a large population. And there is an affordability crisis. We've got the governor signing an executive order and so forth. So you have to balance these things. And I think the idea of risk tolerance is, how do you get all parties and all people at the table so you can decide what does California need? And that means the people in California, the utilities in California, and so forth, in order to come up with a solution that is, maybe optimized, but, at least acceptable to all parties. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joe. I think that's another, really good point that I was trying to make, was that, this graph, and I think the risk tolerance discussion in general, helps us understand that, we are approaching risk tolerance levels. That's the whole goal of doing risk investments and risk mitigations. But we also need to be cognizant that as we approach that, that optimal or that acceptable level of risk, it's going to be more and more expensive to get to that level. And there should be, no, not should, there needs to be a proper discussion about what are the budget constraints, especially from one GRC period to the next, that determine what is the best approach to getting us to that risk tolerance level. So I appreciate these discussions, and I think they're valuable, but I do think that there is a value in presenting this type of information. Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify something very quickly. A moment ago, I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman from Edison, but he said, why don't we just drop this discussion about residual risk until we talk about RMR? And that you said, okay. And I want to make sure that that's not interpreted by anybody, or it wasn't intended by SPD to say, oh, we're taking this out of this proposal and you don't need to comment on it. We're going to defer it to the RMR workshop and just forget about this for now. I don't think that's what you meant, but I know how this works, and people might.
Sure. Yeah. No. I hope that what Brian meant is that, we don't necessarily need to belabor this point in this particular workshop, but I don't see the value in removing that discussion from this particular proposal, and also because it helps frame the discussion in the RMR. And so having this discussion now means that we can continue the discussion in the RMR workshop and in the RMR staff proposal, and comments on both of those. So I encourage everybody to take the opportunity to comment here in the comment period for this staff proposal, but also in the RMR when we get to that point. Thank you. And actually, on that note, I should probably start wrapping this up because we're right at 12:30, and so we're going to have a continued discussion on tomorrow. That's going to be focused much more on topics like exceedance curves and the risk tolerance working group, and then we'll introduce a little bit more about portfolios, which we kind of hinted at a little bit today. But I think that once we start digging into that concept a little bit, it may help to address some of the questions that we had earlier. Great. Thanks everybody for a robust discussion today. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to continuing the conversation tomorrow. Thanks a lot. And
thanks.
Oh, yes, actually, thanks, Commissioner, for joining us. If you had some final words, I should give you that opportunity because I'm not sure if you'll be able to join us the next 2 days.
I won't be able to join for the next 2 days, but I'll just offer my brief thanks to the Safety Policy Division and all of the stakeholders here today for the thoughtful engagement with our material as we work to make continue to refine the ramp process and the GRC process to better quantify risk evaluation and make sure that we're very thoughtful about customers' budgets and how we approach reducing risk in a way that's going to be effective for customers and is going to meet their needs on the cost side as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And I'll go ahead and stop